Before dawn burned off the Har on the Moray Firth, people were already shaping the land into a theatre of memory. They raised circles that still catch the wind, set stones that catch the sun, and carved the first faint grammar of a northern story into earth and rock. Those early farmers of the late Neolithic did not leave chronicles, yet their monuments behave like sentences you can still read. At Orkney's ringed temples and Caithness's cairns, alignments bind sky to ground. Midwinter light threads chambers with a precision that whispers of patient eyes and settled ritual. Across the firths and islands, settlements stitched together fields of barley and patches of grazing. Longhouses, timber posts, and stone-walled enclosures marked communities that endured season by season. What they lacked in metal, they made up for in mastery of stone. Slabs fitted tight without mortar. Slabs heaved aloft to form lintels. Slabs set in circles where ceremonies unfolded. The sea was not a barrier, but a road. Boats stitched the archipelagos into a single neighborhood. Even in this early landscape, you sense a habit that will define the far north. People turning coastlines into corridors. Among the standing circles, ancestors mattered as much as crops. Burials curated the dead with careful placement. Bones and offerings were arranged with meanings we can feel but not translate. Ritual and subsistence ran side by side like twin streams. When copper and then bronze reached these shores, the new metals joined old stone rather than replacing it. Axe heads and ornaments gleamed in graves, but the culture still spoke in megaliths. Brock's to be still a dream. The North adapted new tools without surrendering its older language of place. Through the Bronze Age, craft deepened. Smiths hammered skill from imported ingots. Traders ferried prestige goods up the Atlantic spine. Beads of glass, pins of bronze, a flash of gold. It all found its way into the hands of chiefs who claimed paths, pastures, and harbors. Hilltops grew watchful, palisades bit into summits. Fire-blackened posts and rampart rings tell us that power had to be seen to be believed. In a world of islands and promontories, control was visibility, and the height of your walls was a statement as much as a shield. By the Iron Age, the North had perfected a new architectural boast, the Broch. On storm-bitten headlands and in green glens, great circular towers of dry stone rose like clenched fists. With double-skinned walls and winding stairs, they were feats of engineering and symbols of authority. Families and followers sheltered within. Hearth smoke seeped through thatch while cattle lowed in the court. Not every community built them, and not every tower dominated a kingdom, but the idea mattered. Here was a people turning stone into stature, parading skill, concentrating labor, and insisting on presence. Meanwhile, hill forts multiplied across the mainland. Places such as Tapanoth and Craig Fadrig look out over river valleys and firths, commanding routes that mattered, ways animals moved, ways strangers came. Enclosures were renewed over generations, ramparts thickened, entrances funneled visitors along pathways where every step could be judged. This was politics in timber and stone, an architecture of negotiation and warning. Feasting vessels and ironwork hint at gatherings where alliances were toasted and rivalries measured. To live here was to live with neighbors you could not ignore. In the background, language moved like tidewater. Celtic speech, brought northward over centuries of contact and migration, folded into local voices. Names for hills and waters shifted. Gods and heroes took on familiar, yet new shapes. If we had a recording of a winter feast, we might hear kinship terms and warrior boasts with echoes from across the Irish Sea and far along the Atlantic facade, braided into the North's own cadences. Identity in this era was not a straight line, but a weave. Old threads and fresh dye, local looms working foreign wool. What the first farmers left in stone, later warriors wrote in iron. Swords and spears, bits and bridle fittings, shield bosses and mail. These announced a society where status could be carried at the hip. Yet even the gear of war cannot disguise the domestic rhythm. Querns ground grain, spindle whirls spun wool. Cattle herds snorted mist at dawn. Wealth often had hooves. Cattle, sheep, and swine were walking ledgers, their numbers and health a truer measure of power than any horde. Raids and retaliations negotiated the movement of animals as much as territories. Far to the south, the Mediterranean world sharpened its gaze on the misted edge of the map. Traders and scouts told tales of a rugged land beyond the broader lowlands, a place of hills, bogs, and ferocious seas. When legions finally looked north in earnest, they found not a void, but a mosaic. Confederated groups that could gather fast, disperse faster, and fight in ground they knew by heart. The first direct clash of that mosaic with imperial ambition came under a governor determined to make his name. On a day remembered as Mons Graupius, sometime in the 1st century A.D., a Roman army marched to the edge of the highlands and met a massed northern host. The historian who tells the story emphasizes discipline versus fury, open order against rush and raw. Whatever the precise numbers, the scene is clear enough. An empire trying to pin down a wind. The battle's result, Romans claiming victory, the Highlanders receding into the hills, did not settle the north. It merely taught everyone how little a pitched engagement could change a landscape built on dispersal and persistence. After the clash, forts sprouted along the river lines and through the low country. Roads pressed forward, mile by mile, then faltered. Garrisons watched empty horizons and counted shadows. Patrols found that a foe who will not stand still is less a target than a rumor. To hold ground in the far north, an army needed not just men and money, but a way to turn moor and mountain into something it could read. That literacy never quite arrived. Seasons unraveled the long supply lines. Timber rotted, frost bit stone, and the local calculus of risk favored ambush over stand-up fights. From this stalemate came a pair of lines that would define experience for centuries. Hadrian's Wall, raised in AD 122, threw a stone sentence across Britain, a frontier written in ditches and towers and marching camps. 2 decades later, the Antonine Wall pushed the script north to the Forth and Clyde, testing whether another line might hold. The walls were not merely military, each became a market, a customs point, a conversation. Traders and families moved along their length. Information seeped through their gates. South of the stones, imperial law. North of them, a world that watched, traded, and refused to be absorbed. In that watching world, faces were marked by more than weather. Tattooing and body art, celebrated by outside observers who loved to exoticize the frontier, signaled belonging. Whether with pigment, puncture, or both, skin carried stories, kin ties, battle deeds, rites of passage. A nickname born from such practices would later stick, a label first used by outsiders and then, in time, adopted as a banner. Long before that name hardened, the habits it described were already rooting an identity grounded in endurance and display. Coastal strongholds scanned sea lanes for sails as carefully as hill forts scanned river routes for dust. The ocean never stopped being a road. Island communities in Orkney and Shetland shared feasts and fears with mainland neighbours. Ferries of skinboat and plank tied them together like beads. Harbourhead settlements planned for sudden guests, some welcome, some not. The skills that mattered were seamanship, stock-keeping, and the delicate art of alliance. Leaders rose who could marshal those gifts and make themselves necessary in a landscape that punished arrogance. Across these centuries, religion shaded from ancestral rites toward a curiosity about new creeds without discarding the old. Offerings continued at springs and hilltops. Carved stones continued to fix memory in place. Travelers brought rumors of a faith born far to the south and east. But for now, the north still spoke with its own gods. When winter storms hammered the coast and the aurora walked like green fire over black water, people huddled around hearths and told ancestral tales that set courage against cold. By AD 200, the elements that would feed a distinct northern kingdom were already in the soil. A habit of building in stone, a mastery of the sea, a politics of watchful heights and swift gatherings, a taste for marks on skin and marks on rock, a repertoire of alliances that could stretch from island to island and valley to valley. South of the frontier lines, officials wrote reports about a restless periphery. North of the walls, communities wrote themselves into the land with towers and rings, with paths and cairns, with rites and raids. What emerged from that long prelude was not a vacuum waiting to be conquered, but a culture rehearsed for resilience. Empire could push, map, and measure. It could raise walls and plant flags. It could not dissolve a people who treated landscape as lineage. The first part of the story, then, is less about a name than a posture. Faces turned to wind and water, backs to warm stone, eyes trained on every pass. A society ready to be labelled by strangers, ready to be misunderstood, and ready, in time, to make the misunderstanding into a strength. Soon, the painted ones would step out from the mist, with a name the world would not forget. Frontiers are not just lines on a map. They are places where stories collide. To the Romans, Britain's northern edge felt like the end of the known world. Their roads ended in stone walls. Their towns thrived on trade and law. But beyond those boundaries stretched something different. Hills that rolled into mist, glens guarded by ancient forests, and shorelines beaten by restless seas. Beyond the familiar, the land dissolved into rumour. From that rumour, a new name emerged, one that would outlast the empire itself, the Picti, the Painted Ones. Earlier generations of Roman writers had spoken vaguely of the Caledonians and Maeatae, tribes who harried forts, ambushed patrols, and disappeared into their highland strongholds. But around the beginning of the 3rd century AD, the vocabulary shifted. Sources began to use a fresh term, one that hinted at something distinctive. These northerners, it was said, marked their bodies. Tattoos, dyes, or intricate art covered their skin, turning warriors into living canvases. Whether this was literal observation or a Roman flourish meant to exoticize them, the word carried an edge. Picti was shorthand for everything resistant, wild, and unbending about northern Britain. It was less about what they truly looked like, and more about what they represented, people who could not be subdued. The timing of this new label was no coincidence. In AD 208, Septimius Severus, Emperor of Rome, personally marched into Scotland at the head of one of the largest armies ever assembled on the island. He was determined to succeed where previous governors had faltered, to finally bring the north to heel. Camps were built in long lines across the lowlands. Roads were cut through moors and valleys, bridges repaired, and forts manned. On maps, it looked like progress. On the ground, it was a nightmare. The further the legions pressed into the hills, the more their discipline was tested by enemies who refused to fight by the book. The Picts, or those whom Rome now called by that name, did not gather for pitched battles. They watched, They waited, and then they struck. Patrols were swallowed by bogs, where footing gave way under heavy armor. Convoys were harassed until their supply wagons burned. Ambushes bled men away without offering a target to retaliate against. Roman sources admit, even if grudgingly, that this was not a war of glorious victories, but one of exhaustion. Severus reported triumphs to the Senate, raised monuments to himself, and claimed Britain pacified. Yet when the legions pulled back, the land reverted immediately to its own rhythm. Raids resumed, forts trembled, and the frontier line remained as fragile as ever. What followed revealed more about Pictish power than any one battle could. Almost as soon as Roman troops withdrew to safer ground, waves of incursions surged southward. They came on foot across the uplands, striking pastures and small settlements, or by boat along the coast, where ships could slip past garrisons and strike villages in the shadow of Roman towns. Cattle were driven off, crops destroyed, captives taken. The aim was not conquest in the Roman sense. It was disruption, plunder, and prestige. Success in raiding raised a leader's standing, and that success could be shared across allied groups, at least for a season. These raids revealed something critical. The Picts were not merely fragmented tribes acting at random. The scale of attacks suggested cooperation. Confederacies, loose, shifting alliances, must have been forming. A chieftain who could call together warriors from several valleys would wield influence, though probably only for as long as the campaign lasted. It was a system of power, designed for flexibility. Unity was temporary, but effective. Leadership was situational, but respected. In such a landscape, political centralization was neither possible nor desirable. What mattered was the ability to rally quickly, to strike hard, and to disperse before a stronger foe could retaliate. Rome struggled to respond. The Antonine Wall, reoccupied in bursts of optimism, proved too expensive to hold. Hadrian's Wall, further south, was strengthened. Its gates narrowed, its watchtowers expanded. Garrisons grew along the frontier, mile castles dotted the landscape, and mounted patrols scouted the valleys. Yet none of this ever provided certainty. A wall could stop a formal army. It could not stop raiders who knew every path through bog and forest. The frustration of governors is preserved in the endless repetition of their reports. Victories claimed, stability announced, only for the same cycle of raids to erupt again within months. Behind Roman anxiety lay a growing recognition. However much they mocked or demonized the painted northerners, the empire had begun to see them as something distinct, not just another set of local tribes. The Picts had become an idea, a collective presence. Their name carried weight in Roman records, because they represented more than nuisance. They symbolized the empire's failure to impose its will on the whole island. Every time their painted bodies appeared in reports, it was a reminder that Rome had limits. The frontier shaped both sides of this relationship. For Rome, it was a boundary to defend, a line where soldiers drilled and administrators counted costs. For the Picts, it was an opportunity. Walls meant concentrated garrisons, concentrated supplies, concentrated wealth, and weak spots waiting to be exploited. The existence of the frontier created a shared identity for those living beyond it. They were not simply Caledonians, Maiatai, or other tribes anymore. They were the people on the other side, the people Rome had given a single name. At the same time, the Picts were not only raiders. Archaeological evidence from this period, hill forts renewed, brocks repaired, settlements expanding, suggests communities growing in complexity. Farms fed larger households, craftwork spread, and exchange with the south, whether through trade or plunder, brought new goods into circulation. The frontier was porous. Roman glass beads, brooches, and coins have turned up in northern sites, objects that may have been traded, looted, or gifted as part of diplomacy. To the Romans, the Picts were a threat. To the Picts, Rome was both enemy and resource, a giant that could be harassed, borrowed from, and occasionally bargained with. By the end of the 3rd century, the name had stuck. The Picti were now a recognized presence in the wider Roman world. Alongside the Scotti from Ireland and Saxons from across the North Sea, they were counted as one of the 3 great raiding peoples who battered the western edges of the empire. Yet among them, the Picts were closest, most familiar, and in many ways the most unnerving. Unlike the others, they were not distant foreigners, they were neighbors. Their strongholds could be seen from the hills beyond the frontier. Their raids launched from valleys just a few days' march away. For Roman chroniclers, this made them a constant menace. For the Picts themselves, it may have been the crucible in which a collective identity formed, raiding, resisting, and forcing an empire to acknowledge them bound disparate tribes into something more durable. In the clash between frontier and highland, between walls and wilderness, a people stepped into the written record for the first time. What the Romans saw was not the whole story, far from it. Their descriptions of body paint, savagery, and chaos tell us as much about Roman prejudice as about northern reality. But names have power. With Picti, the Romans gave their opponents a new label, one that outlasted the legions themselves. For the next 6 centuries, that word would carry the identity of Scotland's lost kingdom. The Picts had not yet carved their symbol stones, built their great fortresses, or established their confederations of kings. That would come later. In this first glimpse, they appear only in shadow, through the fearful eyes of an empire that could not control them. And yet, even in shadow, they were unforgettable. Painted, elusive, defiant, they had become more than rumour. The North now had a name. Darkness was never still on Rome's northern frontier. Long after garrisons lit their watchfires on Hadrian's Wall, movement stirred beyond the glow. Shadows crossing bogs, the faint splash of oars against tidewater, the whisper of warriors ready to strike. By the 4th century AD, the Picts had moved from being a name in Roman reports to a power that defined life on the borderlands. They were not content to defend their hills. They were on the offensive, raiding deeper and harder than ever before. The scale of these attacks marked a new phase. Early skirmishes had been nuisances. Now the raids grew into coordinated assaults involving hundreds, sometimes thousands of warriors. From the north and east they came, slipping past patrols, striking farmsteads, villas, and undefended settlements. The frontier walls still loomed across Britain, but they no longer guaranteed safety. Instead of one army sweeping forward, waves of smaller Pictish bands battered the province like relentless surf. The Romans had faced great tribal coalitions before, Gauls, Germans, Dacians, but here the challenge was different. The Picts did not need to defeat legions outright. They only needed to bleed the frontier until Rome weakened. Sea power was their sharpest new weapon. Roman writers increasingly describe seaborne raids, swift strikes launched from long, narrow boats hugging the coast. Pictish warbands learned to slip past headlands and land where defences were thinnest. This was not merely opportunism, it was strategy shaped by geography. The Picts were masters of the inlets and firths of northern Scotland, and those waters became launching pads for expeditions into Roman Britain. In these raids, they were not alone. Alliances with the Scotti from Ireland and Saxon pirates from across the North Sea created what Roman officials called the Barbarica Conspiratio, a confederation of enemies who attacked by land and sea. To defend the island, Rome poured resources into Britain. Forts along Hadrian's Wall were reinforced, and coastal defences, later known as the Saxon shore forts, were strengthened from Kent to the Wash. Yet despite the building projects, Britain became one of the empire's most unstable provinces. Garrison troops were overworked and underpaid, civil settlements shrank under pressure, and leaders struggled to maintain authority. By the middle of the century, the chronicler Ammianus Marcellinus was describing Britain as harried by the united tribes of Picts, Saxons, Scots, and Atticotti. Among these, the Picts were the closest, the most familiar, and often the first to be blamed whenever the frontier faltered. Within Pictland itself, a new figure emerges from legend and tradition: Drust, son of Urup. Later sources credit him with a reign of 60 years and 100 battles, a mix of myth and memory that nonetheless reflects the era's turbulence. Whether Drust was one man or a composite memory of several war leaders, the tradition signals the rise of kingship. Raids required coordination, distribution of spoils, and charisma to bind warriors together. Out of that crucible, figures like Drust stepped into authority, not as absolute monarchs, but as war chiefs whose reputations spread across valleys and generations. The endurance of Drust's legend suggests how identity was consolidating. Pictish power was no longer just tribal and local. Raids were forging a larger sense of belonging, a recognition that these painted northerners could act together in ways that alarmed the empire. Victory brought prestige, prestige brought followers, and followers brought continuity. For the first time, kingship in Pictland carried weight beyond one tribe's boundary. Meanwhile, Rome itself was shifting. The 4th century saw an empire increasingly strained by crises elsewhere. Persian wars in the east, Germanic invasions on the Rhine and Danube, political instability at the center. Britain was important but peripheral. Troops were often withdrawn for continental emergencies, leaving the island vulnerable. Each time the frontier was left thinly defended, the Picts surged south. For the people of Roman Britain, the threat was constant. Villas in the north fell into ruin. Farmland near the wall was abandoned. Marketplaces shrank. Archaeology tells the same story. Coins stop circulating widely in these regions. Pottery imports decline. And rural prosperity gives way to fear and insecurity. The painted northerners had turned Roman order upside down. What made the Picts especially dangerous was their adaptability. Unlike some tribal groups who crumbled under Roman counterattacks, they never relied on a single tactic. When the legions advanced, the Picts melted into the hills. When the walls stiffened, they turned to the sea. When Roman patrols dominated the coast, they allied with Irish raiders to strike deeper inland. It was a strategy of constant adjustment, and it exhausted governors who tried to keep up. Even when Rome claimed victory in pitched battles, the cycle of raids began again almost immediately. Defeating the Picts was like fighting the weather. Storms could be driven back, but they always returned. This period also shaped Pictish identity through contact. Even as they fought Rome, they were absorbing elements of Roman culture. Some Pictish leaders may have negotiated with governors, exchanging hostages, gifts, or tribute. Roman goods entered Pictland: glass beads, brooches, silver vessels, not just as loot, but also as markers of prestige. A Pictish warlord drinking from a Roman cup was displaying victory twice over. He had both defeated and appropriated the empire's wealth. In this way, the Picts turned Rome into a resource, a reservoir of symbols and goods that they could fold into their own society. Yet beyond the material, the psychological balance had shifted. Rome had once tried to conquer the north, with campaigns like that of Agricola and Severus. By the late 4th century, the empire no longer spoke of permanent conquest. Instead, officials talked of defense, of holding the line, of containing the painted ones. The Picts had transformed from obstacles into a permanent fact of life, a frontier people who could never be eradicated, only managed. That endurance gave them strength. They had survived Rome at its height. They would survive as Rome itself began to decline. The withdrawal of Roman power in Britain during the early 5th century sealed this transformation. As imperial authority faltered, the frontier system collapsed. Troops were recalled, walls were left unmanned, and towns once protected by legions faced their enemies alone. For the Picts, this was opportunity on a scale unimaginable a century earlier. No longer confined to harrying raids, they could expand influence southward, pressing into territories once guarded by Rome. The north, once the empire's problem, was becoming its own world, independent, assertive, and increasingly self-defined. By the end of the 4th century, the Picts had ceased to be shadows on the wall. They had become a force in their own right, raiders on sea and land, allies and rivals of neighboring peoples, and a society producing kings remembered in legend. The frontier had shaped them, but they had also shaped the frontier, turning walls and forts into monuments to Rome's limits. In resisting, raiding, and enduring, the Picts had written themselves into history. No longer just the painted ones in Roman imagination, they were a people whose power and presence would carry them into the next age of kingdoms. When Rome abandoned Britain in the early 5th century, its walls and forts still stood, but the empire's protection was gone. To the south, towns shrank, villas fell into disrepair, and new powers began carving out territories in the ruins of Roman order. To the north, the Picts entered a new phase of their story. Freed from the constant pressure of legions, they no longer defined themselves merely as raiders. They began to consolidate into recognizable kingdoms, their identity hardening around both tradition and transformation. What had once been a loose federation of tribes was evolving into something larger, a confederation of Pictish kingdoms. Tradition remembers a figure called Cruithne, sometimes styled the father of the Picts. Later sources claim he divided the land among his 7 sons, establishing the 7 great territories of Pictland: Cait, Si, Sershin, Fib, Fidach, Fotla, and Fortriu. These names echo in medieval manuscripts like the Pictish Chronicle, written long after the events it describes. Whether the story of Cruithne was history, myth, or a symbolic genealogy, it served an important function. It explained how diverse regions could be imagined as one people, bound by a shared ancestry. For the Picts, as for many early societies, myth carried political weight. To trace lineage to a founding figure was to claim legitimacy in a world where power depended on kinship. Behind the legend, the geography of these 7 kingdoms tells its own story. Cait corresponded to Caithness in the far north, Say to the lands of Mar and Buchan, Serkin to Angus and the Mearns, Fib to modern Fife, Fidach to Moray and Ross, Fotla to Athol, and Fortriu to Strathern and Menteith. These were not centralized monarchies in the later sense, but regional strongholds, each dominated by its own ruling dynasty. Together, they formed the patchwork of early Pictland. Archaeological evidence, fortresses on hilltops, symbol stones appearing in the landscape, fortified sites like Craig Fadrig near Inverness, suggests that local kings controlled valleys and coasts, competing and cooperating as needed. The timing of this consolidation was no accident. With Rome's retreat, power was up for grabs. In the west, Dál Riata, the Gaelic kingdom of settlers from Ireland, was rising. To the south, Brittonic kingdoms such as Strathclyde were holding on to fragments of Roman inheritance. Across the North Sea, Angles and Saxons were carving new realms out of eastern England. The Picts could not remain scattered. Survival required structure. Confederation was their answer, not a single king overall, but a web of kingdoms bound loosely together, capable of rallying for defense or expansion. At the same time, a quieter revolution was stirring. Christianity, carried across the sea from Ireland and Britain, began seeding itself in Pictish lands. Missionaries journeyed into the north, preaching a new faith that spoke of one God, one law, one salvation. For a society built on kinship gods, ancestor veneration, and rituals tied to land and season, the message was disruptive. Yet it also offered opportunities. Aligning with Christianity meant access to a wider world of learning, diplomacy, and prestige. The first conversions were likely tentative, small communities forming around early monastic outposts. Still, they marked the beginning of a long process that would reshape Pictland's culture and politics. The tension between the old and the new is vividly illustrated by ritual sites. At Burghead, a massive coastal fortress in Moray, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of bull sacrifices, an echo of pre-Christian religious practice. Yet not far from such sites, carved stones began to appear, slabs incised with symbols that mixed native motifs with Christian crosses. This fusion of art suggests a society negotiating its identity, blending the sacred traditions of the ancestors with the imagery of a new faith. The Picts did not abandon their past. They layered the Christian message onto it, creating a hybrid culture that was distinctly their own. Symbol stones are among the most enduring legacies of this era. Simple at first, crescent and V-rod motifs, double discs, enigmatic figures like the so-called Pictish beast. They soon grew more elaborate, standing as boundary markers, memorials, or political statements. They were a script in stone, one that still resists full decipherment. What they undoubtedly did was mark identity. To carve a symbol was to declare presence, to claim lineage, and to communicate belonging. Just as Rome had once written its power in walls, the Picts now wrote theirs in stone, embedding symbols in the landscape that spoke to kin, rival, and stranger alike. At the political heart of this new confederation were the royal centres. Craig Fadrig, overlooking Inverness, is often cited as a key stronghold of Fortriu, the kingdom that would later dominate Pictish affairs. From such fortified hilltops, kings ruled over networks of lesser chiefs, controlled trade routes, and gathered warbands. Authority rested not only on military might, but on feasting, gift-giving, and the maintenance of alliances. A Pictish king's hall was as much a theatre of politics as it was a dwelling. Guests saw the wealth of their host, ate from imported vessels, and listened to poets recite genealogies that bound them to an imagined past stretching back to Cruithne. Relations with Dál Riata added further complexity. These Gaelic neighbours, settled in Argyll and the islands, were both rivals and partners. The sea between them was not a barrier, but a highway, and across it flowed both warriors and missionaries. Some traditions speak of Pictish kings, marrying Irish princesses, forging alliances across cultural lines. Others remember conflict as Gaelic raiders pressed eastward into Pictish territory. The relationship was never static. It oscillated between hostility and cooperation, shaping both kingdoms' futures. Out of this contact, ideas and identities mixed, adding yet another layer to the hybrid nature of Pictland. If raids had defined the Picts in Roman eyes, by the 5th century their story was turning inward, towards state formation. They were no longer only the menace beyond the walls. They were rulers of lands, patrons of faith, and commissioners of art. This was not yet the Pictish kingdom of later centuries, unified under a single powerful king. But the seeds were sown. Each regional kingdom added its strength to a collective identity that outsiders would continue to call Pictland. Still, fragility lay beneath the surface. Confederation depended on the balance of power between local rulers, and unity was always precarious. Alliances could shift with a marriage, a feud, or a raid gone wrong. Rivalry between kingdoms, Fortriu in the south, Kate in the far north, Circin along the coasts, prevented long-lasting central authority. Yet perhaps this very fluidity was also a strength. The Picts had survived Rome by being elusive and adaptive. Now, in the age of kingdoms, their political flexibility continued to protect them. No single defeat could crush the whole confederation. Power was spread, resilient, ready to reassemble. By the end of the 5th century, the Picts were no longer shadows on the edge of empire. They had taken on clearer form, kingdoms with centers of power, rulers remembered in lists, symbols carved into stone, and communities shaped by both ancient rites and Christian preaching. Their neighbors to the south and west would increasingly have to reckon with them, not only as raiders, but as organized polities, capable of diplomacy, conflict, and cultural innovation. The early Pictish Confederation was not the final shape of their world, but it was the beginning of the kingdom as a concept in the north. Out of hills, glens, and coasts once written off as untamed, a political mosaic was emerging, stitched together by legend, lineage, and stone. In the centuries to come, these kingdoms would test their strength against Gaels, Britons, and Saxons alike. For now, they were still finding their form, half in memory, half in archaeology, entirely their own. In the northern kingdoms, power had long been measured in stone. Hill forts crowned the ridges, brocks rose like ancient sentinels, and carved slabs carried the secret language of symbols, the crescent, the double disc, the strange beast whose meaning is still unknown. These marks rooted the Picts to their past. Yet in the 6th century, another kind of mark appeared on their landscape, the cross. Christianity was pushing into Pictland, not as a single sudden revolution, but as a slow tide, mingling with older traditions and reshaping the north in ways neither its kings nor its priests could fully predict. The story of that tide is inseparable from one man, Columba, the Irish monk who left his homeland for exile and mission. In AD 563, he landed with followers on the small island of Iona, off the western coast. From this wind-swept rock, he built a monastery that would become one of the most influential spiritual centers in early medieval Europe. Columba's mission was not aimed only at the Gaels of Dál Riata. His ambitions stretched further. He looked east, across the rugged spine of the highlands, into the territories of the Picts. Adamnan's Life of Columba, written nearly a century later, preserves the most famous episode of this mission. Columba travelled to Inverness, where Bridei MacAlpin, one of the most powerful Pictish kings, ruled from his fortress at Craig Fadrig. The story tells of Columba barred at the gates, praying until they opened of their own accord, and of Bridei finally receiving him with honour. Whether the miracle happened as told or not, the political reality was clear. The abbot of Iona had entered the orbit of Pictish kingship. For Bridei, conversion, or at least openness to the new faith, was more than a personal choice. It was politics. Christianity connected a king to networks stretching across Ireland, Britain, and beyond. Monks carried not only scriptures, but also literacy, diplomacy, and prestige. To host Columba was to gain access to that world, to stand alongside rulers who were already Christian, and to cloak authority in divine sanction. Yet adopting the cross also meant balancing tradition. Bridei presided over a court steeped in ancestral rites, sacred feasts, and seasonal ceremonies. A king who turned entirely away from these risked alienating his own followers. The spread of Christianity was therefore gradual, careful, and strategic. The archaeological record confirms this blending. At Burghead Fortress in Moray, evidence points to bull sacrifices that may have been central to Pictish ritual life. Such ceremonies would not vanish overnight. Instead, they coexisted for generations with Christian preaching. A warrior might receive baptism, but still join in a seasonal sacrifice. A community might raise a cross slab, but still gather at ancient wells believed to hold sacred power. The Pictish response to Christianity was not submission, but adaptation, folding the new into the old. The symbol stones capture this process with striking clarity. Early Pictish carvings display abstract motifs: crescents, zeed rods, double discs, enigmatic animals. With the arrival of Christianity, crosses begin to appear on these stones. At first, the cross is simply one symbol among many. Later, it dominates the design. Yet the older motifs never disappear entirely. Even on the grandest cross slabs, hunting scenes, animals, and ancestral symbols persist. The art of the Picts became a dialogue between faiths, a stone-bound conversation between past and present. Monasteries grew into centers of this transformation. Excavations at Port Mahomac on the Tarbat Peninsula reveal a remarkable sight: a monastery functioning as both spiritual center and industrial hub. Here monks copied manuscripts, carved intricate stone slabs, and crafted fine metalwork. Literacy gave the church enormous influence. In a society where history was preserved through memory and symbol, the ability to write created new kinds of authority. From Port Mahomac and Iona, networks of learning spread through Pictland, carrying both faith and the prestige of scholarship. Kings quickly recognized the value of patronage. Supporting monasteries brought prestige, allies, and legitimacy. A Pictish ruler who founded or endowed a church was not only demonstrating piety, but also projecting power. Christianity tied royal families to saints' cults, relics, and prayers, all of which could be invoked to reinforce authority. Yet kings also had to navigate resistance. Some subjects clung to ancestral rites. Druids or wise men guarded the old knowledge, and rural communities were slow to abandon customs tied to harvests and fertility. Conversion was uneven, strong in royal centers, weaker in the hinterlands, contested at the edges. The relationship with Dál Riata added further weight. The Gaels to the west had embraced Christianity earlier, and their missionaries were moving east. If the Picts rejected the faith, they risked being cast as backward. If they embraced it, they joined a prestigious network stretching across the Irish Sea. Conversion thus became part of the rivalry between kingdoms. Each side used religion as both weapon and bond, a tool of competition and alliance alike. Burial practices show how deeply these changes cut into daily life. Pagan graves often included goods, weapons, ornaments, offerings for the journey. Christian burials, by contrast, were simpler, oriented east to west, stripped of possessions. In some cemeteries, the two traditions overlap, one grave aligned to the rising sun, another beside it with goods for the afterlife. Communities were negotiating belief at the graveside, trying to reconcile old hopes with new promises. The Pictish church itself bore the marks of its origins. In this period, it leaned heavily toward Celtic Christianity, shaped by Irish practice rather than Roman custom. Differences over the dating of Easter and the tonsure worn by monks may seem minor to us, but they were profound in their symbolism. They signaled that the Picts were not passive recipients of a foreign creed, but participants in a broader conversation, shaping their own version of the faith. Later reforms would bring them closer to Rome, but in the 6th century, the church in Pictland had a distinctive voice of its own. Conversion also transformed memory. Stories of saints and miracles began to replace older myths as the foundation of authority. A king might once have traced his lineage back to legendary ancestors like Cruithne. Now he might claim blessing through association with Columba or another holy figure. Monks became the chroniclers of royal deeds and the keepers of genealogies that wove divine favor into dynastic ambition. Christianity reshaped not just worship, but the way history itself was told. Still, the old gods were never fully banished. They lived on in stories, in place names, and in the whispers of ritual practice. Even as crosses dominated new monuments, echoes of pagan belief survived in the background of Pictish life. Christianity may have claimed the official stage, but the older faiths lingered in the wings, reminders that transformation is always a process, never an instant. By the late 6th century, the cross had taken root in Pictland, but the kingdom was far from settled. Missionaries had found patrons, monasteries had risen, and carved stones testified to a society in transition. Yet faith did not silence the clash of arms. The Gaels of Dál Riata were pressing eastward. The Angles of Northumbria looked north with ambition. The next century would test whether the Picts' newfound faith could endure the weight of war. Christianity had entered their world, but survival still depended on warriors, kings, and the defense of their land. The arrival of Christianity did not quieten the north. Kings might host monks at their courts, monasteries might copy gospels on parchment, but beyond the cloisters, the clang of weapons never faded. Pictland stood between rival powers, and no prayer could shield it from the ambitions of its neighbours. Faith had offered new legitimacy. Survival still depended on the spear. To the west, the Gaels of Dál Riata remained constant adversaries. Their kingdom thrived on the sea. Fleets of long, narrow boats carried warriors between Argyll, the Hebrides, and the shores of western Pictland. Christianity had reached them earlier, and through their ties with Iona, they wielded both spiritual and military influence. For Pictish rulers, Dál Riata was an unsettling mirror, another warrior society, but one with stronger fleets, broader alliances, and a surer footing in the new faith. Skirmishes flared regularly along the western seaways, sometimes raids, sometimes outright campaigns for control of fertile valleys and vital ports. The danger from the south was even greater. Northumbria, forged from the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Bernicia and Deira, had become the most powerful force in Britain. Its kings expanded aggressively, subduing Brittonic territories and pressing into Pictish lands. Northumbrian missionaries also travelled north, bringing not only Roman forms of Christianity, but also the political expectations that came with them. Aligning with the Northumbrian church could mean aligning with Northumbrian authority. For the Picts, this intrusion of faith and politics carried familiar echoes. Another empire, another attempt to bind them under an outsider's order. Within Pictland itself, unity was fragile. the Confederation of Kingdoms still produced rival claimants, and no single ruler held uncontested sway. Yet among the shifting dynasties, one power base grew stronger than the rest. Fortriu, centered in the central highlands and valleys of Strathern. From this heartland, kings began to exert wider influence, calling warbands from multiple regions and hosting courts that drew attention beyond their borders. The most prominent of these rulers was Bridei Beli, remembered for his strength and for the decisive role he played in resisting Northumbria. Bridei's rise came at a moment when Northumbria's ambitions reached their peak. King Ecgfrith, confident after victories over Britons and Gaels, led campaigns deep into Pictish territory. Northumbrian influence spread north of the Forth. Some Pictish rulers may even have been forced into submission. For a time, it seemed the Angles might succeed where Rome had failed, dominating the north not with legions, but with Anglo-Saxon warbands and Christian bishops. But Pictish kings had survived stronger threats before. Bridei recognized that open resistance was dangerous, yet submission was ruinous. He chose a middle path, strengthening fortresses, consolidating power, and waiting for the moment when Northumbrian confidence turned into overreach. That moment came in AD 685, in the battle remembered as Dun Nechtan or Nechtansmere. The chronicles are brief, but the outlines are sharp. Ecgfrith marched north with a strong army, pushing deep into Pictish lands. Perhaps he intended to crush Bridei's power once and for all, or perhaps to punish defiance from northern tribes. Either way, the move was reckless. His army, heavy with cavalry and shield-bearing warriors, was suited to open battlefields, not to the boggy, broken terrain of Angus. Bridei seized the advantage. According to later tradition, the Picts used a feigned retreat to lure Ecgfrith into marshland. Once the Northumbrians were entangled, Pictish warriors closed in from stronger positions. Cavalry could not charge effectively. Infantry found themselves slowed by waterlogged ground. Bridei's men struck with precision, surrounding and cutting down their opponents. Ecgfrith himself was killed in the fighting, and his army was destroyed. What began as an invasion ended as a disaster. The victory at Nechtansmere changed the balance of power. Northumbria's dominance in the north collapsed overnight. The loss of a king and a large portion of its elite warriors forced the kingdom to retreat, focusing its efforts on survival rather than conquest. The Picts, once again underestimated, had proven themselves capable not only of resisting, but of annihilating a stronger foe. Their reputation spread, and their kingship gained new authority. The triumph also carried religious resonance. Bede, writing in the early 8th century, framed Ecgfrith's death as divine punishment for arrogance. The Picts, who had recently embraced Christianity more fully, could point to the battle as proof that God favored their cause. Victory on the field became victory in the realm of faith as well, and Bridei's prestige soared. He had defended both land and church, ensuring that Pictland would no longer be treated as a subordinate province of Northumbria. In the aftermath, Pictish kings invested heavily in fortifications and symbols of authority. Dundurn, Forteviot, and Burghead became fortified centres, serving both as defensive positions and as seats of royal ceremony. Here, kings held courts, distributed gifts, and presided over feasts that bound warrior elites to their rule. Royal power was being redefined, not only as the ability to command warbands, but also as the ability to project order and legitimacy across wider territories. Cultural expression followed the same trajectory. Symbol stones became more elaborate, with scenes of hunting, processions, and battles carved alongside crosses. These images were not idle decoration. They were political statements. To carve a cross into stone was to proclaim Christian kingship. To depict warriors and horsemen was to remind viewers of victories like Nechtan's. Art became propaganda, embedding memory into the landscape where no one could ignore it. The consequences of Bridei's success rippled far beyond the battlefield. The Britons of Strathclyde found breathing room, freed from Northumbrian pressure. Dál Riata, weakened by its own struggles, was unable to expand at Pictish expense. Fortriu's dominance within Pictland itself became clearer, setting the stage for a more centralized kingship in the generations ahead. What had once been a confederation of uncertain loyalties was hardening into a kingdom recognized across Britain. Still, unity was never absolute. Rival claimants remained, and the system of matrilineal succession, power often passing through a sister's son rather than a direct heir, ensured constant competition. Yet Bridei's victory gave the Picts something they had lacked before: the prestige of having defeated one of the strongest kingdoms in Britain. That prestige was a currency in its own right, one that future kings would spend carefully as they sought to hold their fragile confederation together. Nechtan's was not the end of conflict. It was the beginning of a new balance. The Picts had proved they could destroy their enemies when threatened, but survival would require more than victories. Diplomacy with Ireland, careful management of the church, and constant defense of coastal strongholds would all be needed in the decades ahead. Bridei had shown the path, but his successors would have to walk it in a world still filled with enemies. Bridei mac Beli inherited a kingdom shaped by triumph and uncertainty. The great victory at Nechtan's in 685 had humbled Northumbria and proven the Picts capable of standing as equals among the powers of Britain. Yet military glory alone could not secure stability. Bridei's challenge was to turn fleeting prestige into lasting authority, to bind fractious dynasties into a single realm. His lineage gave him a formidable advantage. He was the son of Beli, king of Strathclyde, and a Pictish princess, which meant he carried both Britonic and Pictish blood. That dual heritage gave him legitimacy across a wide spectrum of elites. His reign was not merely the triumph of one clan, but the assertion of a shared northern identity, strengthened by kinship ties that stretched across kingdoms. In an age when ancestry was political currency, Bridei's pedigree gave him wealth of a different kind. He ruled from Fortriu, the Pictish heartland. Scholars placed this kingdom in the fertile valleys and uplands of central Scotland, stretching around Strathern and into the Highlands. Fortriu's geography offered strength, access to fertile farmlands, defensive mountain barriers, and routes that led north, west, and south. From fortresses such as Craig Fadrig, perched above the Moray Firth, Bridei commanded not only armies, but the symbolic centre of Pictland itself. These fortresses were more than military redoubts. They were stages of power. Inside their timber halls, feasts displayed the king's generosity. Imported glassware and ornate metalwork signalled wealth. Poets recited genealogies, monks copied texts, and nobles pledged loyalty over ale and roasted meat. Gift-giving was essential. Finely worked brooches, silver chains, and ornaments distributed among retainers tied loyalty through display as much as through blood. Authority was not abstract. It was enacted night after night in the ritual of the hall. Bridei also turned the cross into an instrument of kingship. The Picts had already begun adopting Christianity in earlier generations, but under his reign, the alignment with Roman practice deepened. He supported reforms that distanced the Pictish church from Iona's influence, placing ecclesiastical lands under royal supervision and favouring clerics who backed his authority. In doing so, he secured both divine sanction and practical control of valuable estates. Christianity was not only a creed, it was an administrative tool. Externally, Bridei cultivated diplomacy with care. His links to Strathclyde through his father created a natural alliance across the Clyde Valley. Irish annals suggest correspondence with rulers in Ireland, evidence that the Pictish king was now a figure recognised beyond Britain. Even relations with Northumbria, his former foe, shifted. Defeated but not destroyed, Northumbria remained powerful, and Bridei had to balance hostility with pragmatic peace. Occasional raids may have flared, but the wider pattern was one of uneasy recognition. The Picts were no longer subordinates, they were peers. The symbol stones of this period reflect the confidence of a kingdom asserting itself. Earlier carvings had shown abstract designs. Now stones displayed processions, mounted warriors, and crosses of striking size and intricacy. The Abelemno stones, with their vivid scenes of battle, belong to this cultural flowering. These were not anonymous works of art. They were political statements, set in the landscape to remind everyone, villager, noble, rival, that the Picts were a people with kingship, faith, and permanence. Bridei's reign set a precedent, but the Pictish system of succession guaranteed turbulence. Authority did not pass neatly from father to son. Instead, matrilineal principles meant that nephews, cousins, and brothers could all stake claims. Each king had to balance rival branches of the dynasty, binding them with hostages, marriages, and gifts. Bridei's charisma and heritage had held these tensions in check, but his death in 693 left the equilibrium fragile. The kings who followed faced the same paradox. Pictland was unified in name, but its unity rested on personal authority that had to be continually renewed. Rival claimants vied for dominance. Irish annals record sudden deaths and short reigns, evidence of the knife edge on which royal authority rested. Yet the memory of Bridei's kingship and the structures he strengthened gave these successors a framework. Fortriu remained the centre, fortresses continued as royal halls, and the church increasingly acted as the kingdom's ideological partner. Meanwhile, coastal defences like Burghead underscored Pictish awareness of seaborne threats. This massive promontory fort, with its ramparts and harbour access, likely served as a naval base, housing ships that patrolled the Moray Firth. The very existence of such a site speaks to Bridei's legacy. The Picts were thinking not only of defence, but of projection, able to contest the seas that Gaels and Norse would later roam. Foreign observers increasingly treated the Picts as a kingdom to reckon with. Entries in the Annals of Ulster and the Annals of Tigernach noted their kings, recording victories and deaths. To appear in those records was to matter, to be counted among the recognised powers of the Irish sea world. Bridei had elevated his people from the shadows of Roman prejudice into the annals of Christendom. His successors inherited both his opportunities and his problems. The wealth of the kingdom had grown, but so had the competition for its throne. Each new ruler had to manage nobles who remembered being nearly kings themselves. Each had to court the church while ensuring it did not slip into independence, and each had to remember that Gaels, Britons, and Angles watched closely, ready to exploit any weakness. Bridei MacBeli had shown that a Pictish king could rule not just as a warlord, but as a monarch with prestige across Britain. He left behind a kingdom more unified than it had ever been, but also a crown more coveted than ever before. The next generation would struggle to hold together what he had built. Some would fail. One, Angus MacFergusa, would succeed beyond measure. But before his rise, the Picts would endure a storm of rival claimants and shifting loyalties, a reminder that even unified realms in the north were never free from fracture. After Bridei, unity became harder to sustain. The throne passed quickly between claimants, each trying to hold Fortriu together. From this turbulence, one king, Oengus, would eventually rise, but not before decades of bitter struggle. Power in Pictland had never been simple. Kings did not rule as solitary figures, commanding from above. They reigned through webs of kinship, marriage, rivalry, and fragile loyalty. The system of matrilineal succession, in which authority often passed through a sister's son rather than a direct heir, made every succession a contest. Brothers, nephews, and cousins could all claim legitimacy, and with each new reign, the balance of power shifted. The early 8th century was a time when those rivalries threatened to unmake the unity that Bridei's victories had secured. The Pictish chronicle preserves only fragments of these years, terse lists of names, the occasional length of a reign, little else. But archaeology and annalistic entries from Ireland and Northumbria sketch the outlines. These decades were marked by internal struggles and renewed tension with neighbours, as ambitious kings fought not just for survival, but for recognition as the master of all Pictland. One of the most visible figures was Nechtan Nepos Uerb, who first came to power in 706. His reign was marked from the start by conflict, both within and without. In the west, the Gaels of Dál Riata continued their contest for the coastal lands, raiding into Syrkin and the lands of Fib. In the south, the Northumbrians sought to reclaim some of the dominance lost after Nechtansmere. Their kings, mindful of past defeats, sent both missionaries and armies northward, determined to shape Pictland by persuasion or force. But Nechtan's challenges were not only military. Religion, which had once been a unifying force, was now a battlefield in its own right. The Pictish church had long followed Irish customs, inherited through Columba's legacy at Iona. Roman missionaries, however, argued for conformity with continental practice, above all in the dating of Easter. It was a matter that might seem trivial, but the stakes were high. To side with Iona was to align with the Gaels. To side with Rome was to strengthen ties with Northumbria and the wider church. Nechtan, seeking legitimacy and allies, leaned toward the Roman side. He corresponded with Northumbrian clerics, reorganized church lands, and began to assert royal authority over the ecclesiastical structure. This choice carried political weight. Aligning with Rome gave Nechtan prestige, but it also sparked resistance among factions loyal to Iona. Clerics and nobles who had built their power on Celtic tradition resisted his reforms. In a kingdom where kingship itself was contested, religious division deepened political instability. It was a reminder that in Pictland, faith was never separate from rule. To reshape the church was to reshape the kingdom. Amid this turbulence, the Northumbrians tested their strength again. Raids and skirmishes flared along the southern borders, and Northumbrian influence seeped north through religious patronage and political pressure. The Picts, wary of repeating Ecgfrith's catastrophe, fought more cautiously. The frontier became a zone of constant tension, Anglian kings pressing north with ambition, Pictish kings straining to hold them back without losing ground to rivals at home. The fragility of Nechtan's position became clear in 724, when he was driven from the throne. The sources do not tell us who deposed him. Perhaps a rival claimant with stronger backing, perhaps internal factions angered by his church reforms. For a decade, other rulers held sway, while Nechtan languished in exile. His return to power in 728 was brief and embattled, but it reveals the cyclical nature of Pictish politics. Kings could fall and rise again, legitimacy never entirely extinguished. During this same period, another figure was rising who would dominate the later years of the century. Oengus MacFergusa, remembered in Irish annals as a formidable and ruthless king. His path to power was marked by violence, culminating in the Battle of Moncrieff in 729, where rival factions clashed for supremacy. Oengus emerged victorious, his rivals slain or scattered, and from this base he began to extend his influence across all Pictland. The annals speak of him in tones of respect and dread, a king who imposed order by the sword as much as by lineage. The society that sustained these rivalries was itself in transition. Warrior aristocrats still dominated politics, their loyalty secured through gift-giving, feasting, and the promise of plunder. Yet monasteries were also gaining influence, controlling lands, and producing literate clerics who could bolster or undermine a king's legitimacy. In these decades, Pictland balanced between two poles, the sword-bearing noble and the tonsured monk, each vying to shape the kingdom's destiny. Archaeological evidence adds texture to this picture. At sites like Forteviert and Berghead, fortified centres reveal both military strength and ritual significance. Feasting halls, high-status metalwork, and imported goods speak of kingship that relied on spectacle and wealth. Meanwhile, carved stones grew more ambitious, their designs blending native symbols with increasingly elaborate crosses. These monuments were public declarations of power, kings and their supporters setting their mark in stone, reminding rivals and subjects alike of their authority. The Pictish chronicles' terse king lists may read like dry accounting, but behind each name lies drama, battles fought on river plains, halls filled with rival factions whispering betrayal, monks debating theology with the weight of kingdoms in their arguments. Nechtan's fall and Wengus's rise were not isolated events, but part of a constant cycle. Ambitious men pressing claims, alliances shifting, and power never resting in one place for long. By the early 730s, Angus had established himself as the dominant figure, though his full power would unfold in later years. Nechtan's attempts at church reform, though controversial, left a lasting imprint, aligning Pictland more firmly with Roman Christianity. The decades of rivalry had not weakened the kingdom beyond repair. Instead, they had hardened it. Through conflict, Pictland learned to endure. Through shifting thrones, it learned to adapt. The wars and rivalries of these years did not produce a single unbroken dynasty, nor a settled kingdom, but they prepared the ground for something greater. Out of the turbulence of succession and reform, emerged rulers who would finally bind the Picts into a force capable of shaping all of northern Britain. The next act in the story would belong to Angus, and under his reign, the Pictish kingdom would reach its greatest height. Nechtan, son of Darile, remembered in the chronicles as Nechtan Nepos Uerb, is one of the first Pictish kings we can glimpse with any detail. His reign, beginning in the early 730s, came at a moment when kingship was not simply about battle, but also about belief. The Pictish kingdom had grown strong under Bridei, and Wengus's rise was still ahead. But Nechtan's greatest achievement was not on the battlefield. It was in the church. From his seat in Fort Trieu, Nechtan looked beyond his borders for models of authority. He wrote to clerics in Northumbria, asking for advice on Roman practices, and invited churchmen to instruct his clergy. Most importantly, he enforced the Roman calculation of Easter, rejecting the older Celtic method, followed by Iona and much of the Irish Church. For him, this was not a technical matter of calendars, but a statement of identity. By aligning Pictland with Rome, Nechtan positioned his kingdom as part of the wider Christian world and distanced it from the influence of Dál Riata. The reforms had consequences at home. Ecclesiastical lands were reorganized, monasteries reoriented toward Roman practice, and bishops gained prominence under royal patronage. The Pictish king was not ceding power to the church, he was drawing it into his orbit. By backing Rome's authority, he reinforced his own, showing himself as a monarch who could dictate not only law and war, but also the faith of his people. In the world of the early Middle Ages, where legitimacy flowed as much from altars as from swords, Nechtan's reforms strengthened the crown. Resistance was inevitable. Clergy and nobles tied to Iona resented the change, and the choice split the kingdom's spiritual loyalties. Yet Nechtan pressed on. He built stone churches in the Roman style, visible statements that Pictland had embraced new standards. Some accounts suggest he even entered monastic life in his later years, though whether this was genuine piety or political theatre is hard to know. What matters is that Nechtan established a precedent. In Pictland, the king could decide the shape of Christianity. While Nechtan reformed the church, another figure was rising, whose impact would surpass all others. Oengus I Macfergusa. His reign, stretching from 729 to 761, marks the high point of Pictish power. The Irish annals are filled with his campaigns, victories, and alliances. He was no caretaker of the throne, but a conqueror who turned Pictland into the dominant force of northern Britain. Oengus's path to power was forged in battle. In 729, he seized the throne after defeating rivals at the Battle of Moncrief, a clash that left his competitors dead or dispossessed. From that moment, he ruled with relentless energy. Within a few years, he had subjugated Dál Riata, bringing the Gaelic kingdom under Pictish control. It was the first time a Pictish king had ruled both peoples, creating a dominion that stretched from the Firth of Forth to the Hebrides. The conquest of Dál Riata was more than a military achievement. It carried symbolic weight. For generations, the Gaels had pressed into Pictish lands, raiding and challenging their neighbours. Now the tables had turned. The Pictish king controlled their fortresses, their fleets, and their monasteries. It was a unification, perhaps temporary, but real, under a Pictish crown. Angus did not confine himself to the west. He fought Britons in Strathclyde, extended influence into the Orkneys, and dealt with Northumbrian kings as a rival rather than a subordinate. To Ireland, the annals record his presence as a figure whose campaigns affected the balance of power across the sea. For 3 decades, his name appears as a constant. Oengus the Victorious, Oengus the Powerful, Oengus the King who made the Picts into Britain's northern empire. Power was displayed not only in battles, but also in stone. The age of Oengus saw the flowering of Pictish art, especially in monumental carvings. The Aberlemno stones, with their intricate scenes of cavalry, hunting, and warfare, date to this period. The Hilton of Cadboll stone, a masterpiece of Pictish sculpture, shows both Christian and secular imagery. A cross of elaborate interlace on one side, a royal procession with horsemen and musicians on the other. These stones were not private devotions, but public monuments, placed where travellers and subjects could see them. They proclaimed kingship in symbols more lasting than memory. The designs themselves remain enigmatic: crescents and V-rods, double discs, and the so-called Pictish beast. Their meaning is debated, but within the kingdom, they were unmistakable signs of belonging. Combined with crosses, they became a hybrid language, fusing ancestral motifs with Christian authority. In Wengus's reign, this language reached its height. The stones, scattered across the land, formed a visible network of identity, tying local communities to the kingdom and the king. Yet for all his strength, Wengus ruled a fragile system. Pictland was not a centralized state, but a federation held together by charisma, victory, and fear. The same succession system that had produced him could just as easily undo his heirs. Nephews and cousins lurked in every court, ready to claim descent and raise their banners. Unity depended on the constant presence of a king who could command obedience through both gift and violence. The later years of Angus's reign show the strains of this fragility. After decades of dominance, cracks appeared. Dál Riata, though subdued, simmered with resentment. Alliances were costly to maintain, and constant campaigning drained resources. The annals note defeats as well as victories, reminders that even the greatest of kings could not control fortune forever. Still, when Angus died in 761, he left behind a legacy unmatched in Pictish history. For one generation, the Picts had been the masters of northern Britain. Nechtan's reforms and Wengus's conquests together define this age. One gave the Picts a church aligned with Rome, a foundation for legitimacy that reached beyond the Isles. The other gave them an empire of sorts, an assertion of power that reverberated through neighboring kingdoms. Church and sword, altar and battlefield. This was the Pictish Golden Age. Its brilliance, however, carried shadows. A kingdom so dependent on a single ruler's strength could not guarantee continuity. The moment Wengus's grip loosened, rivals would rise, and unity would fracture again. The next century would prove how fragile the Pictish realm remained, even at the height of its cultural and military achievement. Coastal life in Pictland had always lived with the sea's rhythm. Fishermen cast their nets into firths, traders sailed between islands, monks settled on headlands where the surf beat against rock. The sea was road and boundary, gift and danger. In the late 8th century, that balance broke. From beyond the horizon came long, sleek ships, their prows carved like beasts, their warriors armed with axes and fire. The Norse had arrived. The first shock fell in AD 795, when raiders struck the monastery at Iona. For generations, Iona had been a beacon of learning and sanctity, a place tied by memory to Columba himself. To see it plundered, its monks cut down, its treasures carried off, was a wound felt across all the northern kingdoms. For the Picts, the news was more than tragedy. It was warning. The coastlines that had carried trade and missionaries could now deliver enemies who struck without warning, then vanished back into the sea. The pattern repeated with cruel regularity. In 802, and again, in 806, Iona was attacked, the second time with slaughter so great that 68 monks were killed. The Norse were not like the Gaels or Angles, who came to conquer, to hold land, or to extract tribute. They came first as raiders, hit-and-run assaults that left ruins and ash where once stood churches and workshops. Monasteries were their favoured targets, not for theology, but for treasure. Chalices, reliquaries, gospel books bound in jewelled covers, all became loot. Pictland's own coasts suffered as well. The monastery at Port Mahomet, a thriving centre of art and learning on the Tarbat Peninsula, was destroyed in these early waves of raiding. Archaeology tells the story. Charred remains, smashed workshops, interrupted scripts in half-finished manuscripts. A community that had been producing some of the most beautiful sculpture and texts of the age was abruptly silenced. What the Picts had built in stone and faith, the Norse reduced to fragments. The Pictish kings could not ignore the threat. Constantine I, 789 to 820, is remembered as a ruler who tried to organize resistance. His reign saw efforts to defend the coastline, strengthening fortresses like Berghead on the Moray Firth, with its massive ramparts and commanding views of the sea. From such strongholds, fleets of Pictish ships could be launched to patrol the firths and intercept raiders. Yet the challenge was immense. Longships were swift, shallow-keeled, and capable of slipping into inlets where no fortification could guard. Defense meant not only soldiers, but vigilance, constant and exhausting. The Norse brought more than raids. They began to settle. The islands of Orkney and Shetland, lying like stepping stones off the northern coast, were too strategically valuable to remain untouched. By the early 9th century, Norse settlers had begun to claim them, turning what had once been Pictish territory into bases for further expansion. From there, raiding parties could strike into the Hebrides, Caithness, and beyond, while families took root and new communities grew. It was the beginning of a transformation that would permanently alter the balance of power in the north. For the Picts, the Viking threat struck at their core. Monasteries were not just places of prayer. They were centers of knowledge, scriptoria where texts were copied, treasuries of relics that sanctified kingship. To see them burned was to watch the pillars of legitimacy topple. Kings responded by moving relics inland, protecting them from coastal assault. Some accounts tell of St. Columba's relics being removed from Iona to Dunkeld, deep in safer territory, a symbolic retreat that signaled the end of coastal sanctity. Yet the Picts were not passive victims. Evidence suggests they mounted naval counterattacks from bases like Berghead. These were not great sea battles of later sagas, but skirmishes, attempts to intercept raiders or reclaim plunder. The very fact that the Picts adapted to naval warfare at all speaks to their resilience. They had long been warriors of land and hill. Now they were forced to become warriors of the sea. The Viking impact was not purely destructive. Contact, even violent contact, carried exchange. Norse weapons, ornaments, and techniques entered Pictish society. Some warriors may have joined Norse crews, others married into Norse families. In time, the line between raider and settler blurred. But in this first generation of encounters, the memory preserved is one of violence and fear. The word Viking became synonymous not with trade, but with fire. Constantine I's reign ended in 820, a period marked by this struggle to adapt. His successors would face even greater trials, as Viking raids deepened into permanent settlements across the Northern Isles and Hebrides. For the Picts, the challenge was existential. Internal rivalries had always threatened unity, but those rivalries could be contained within the structures of kinship. The Norse threat was different. It was external, unpredictable, and indifferent to the symbolic authority of crosses or stones. The Picts could defeat Angles in battle and Gaels in campaigns. But how to defeat the sea? What followed in the 9th century was not the end of Pictland, but its transformation. The Vikings forced kings to rethink defense, to strengthen inland centers, to guard their relics and halls more carefully. Pictish kingship itself began to change under this pressure, growing sharper, more militarized, and more focused on resilience. The arrival of the Norse was catastrophe, but also catalyst. For centuries, the Picts had been the painted people of the north, defined by resistance to Rome, Angles, and Gaels. Now they faced a foe who brought no frontier lines, no diplomacy, no respect for sanctuaries. The longships carved their shadows across the coastlines, and in their wake, the Picts had to decide whether their kingdom could endure. The story of Pictland was entering its most dangerous chapter. The longships did not disappear after Constantine I's reign. They multiplied. Coastal monasteries, once rebuilt, were struck again. Harbours that had welcomed traders now braced for raiders. In this age of turmoil, the Picts found themselves both tested and in some ways strengthened. For while the Vikings battered their coasts, their oldest rival, Dál Riata, faltered. For centuries, the Gaelic kingdom in Argyll and the Hebrides had been both a thorn in the Pictish side and a mirror of their ambitions. Its fleets controlled the western sea lanes. Its monasteries carried prestige. Its kings claimed kinship with powerful dynasties in Ireland. But by the early 9th century, the Gaels were in decline. Viking raids fell heavily on the Western Isles, where communities were more exposed, and the kingdom's resources were drained. Once proud Dál Riata, whose warbands had raided Pictish shores for generations, now found itself on the defensive, its territory shrinking, its power fractured. The Picts seized the opportunity. Kings such as Angus's descendants and later Eogan Mac asserted overlordship over Dál Riata. For a brief period, Pictland and the Gaelic West were ruled under the same crown. The chronicles record that in the 800s and 30s, Eogan reigned as king of both the Picts and the Scots. This was unprecedented. The two peoples, so often at war, briefly unified under a single monarch. The symbolism was immense. For generations, Gaelic poets had sung of victories over Picts, and Pictish kings had raided Gaelic shores. Now one throne claimed both peoples. Diplomatically, it gave the Picts stature. To outside eyes, from Ireland to Northumbria, the north of Britain appeared more unified than ever before. Fortriu's kings had outlasted Rome, humbled Northumbria, and now subsumed their Gaelic neighbours. The dream of a great northern realm seemed close. But dreams are fragile when longships prowl the horizon. The Norse were no longer raiders alone. By this time, they had settled in Orkney and Shetland, transforming the islands into bases of power. From there, they struck deep into the Hebrides, breaking Dál Riata's fragile hold and cutting its kings off from Irish allies. The Gaels of the West were not merely beaten by the Picts, they were strangled by the Vikings. The Picts, too, suffered. No matter how strong their inland fortresses, the coast remained vulnerable. Treasures and relics were moved inland. Kings tried to fortify key harbours, but the sheer length of the shoreline made defence impossible. Each raid weakened trust, eroded resources, and spread fear. When Eogan led armies, he fought on two fronts, suppressing Viking threats on the western seas and holding the loyalty of Pictish nobles at home. In 839, catastrophe struck. At the Battle of Fortiviot, Viking forces clashed with the Picts and their Gaelic allies. The fighting was devastating. Eogan, king of the Picts and the Scots, was killed, along with much of the Pictish nobility. In a single day, the carefully woven fabric of Pictish kingship was torn apart. The loss of a king was not unusual in Pictish history. Succession disputes were common, but the scale of death among the aristocracy was unprecedented. Dozens of nobles, commanders, and potential heirs perished. The matrilineal system, already complex, now faced a vacuum. Rival claimants rose from every branch of the royal houses, but none had the bloodline or strength to command all of Pictland. Unity dissolved into fragmentation. The consequences rippled outward. Without strong Pictish leadership, the tenuous hold over Dál Riata collapsed. Whatever promise had existed of a lasting union between Picts and Gaels dissolved in the blood of Fortiviot. The Gaels regrouped under new leaders, while the Picts struggled to recover from the loss of so much of their ruling elite. The dream of a northern empire gave way to a scramble for survival. It was in this vacuum that a new figure began to rise, Kenneth MacAlpin, a Gaelic leader whose lineage tied him to the royal houses of both Picts and Scots. His story belongs to the next chapter, but his ascent was only possible because the battle at Fortiviot had destroyed the old order. Without that disaster, the Pictish dynasty might have held its dominance for another generation. With it, the stage was set for transformation. Archaeology shows how unsettled these decades were. Fortified sites that had thrived in the 8th century show signs of abandonment or hurried rebuilding. The material culture of wealth, fine brooches, imported vessels, ornate stone carving, diminished in the early 9th century. Viking influence appears in weaponry and ornament, suggesting both violent contact and cultural exchange. The Picts were not erased overnight, but their world was being reshaped. Kingship itself changed under the weight of crisis. Where earlier rulers had balanced church patronage and military prestige, 9th century kingship became more brittle. Armies were smaller, resources thinner, alliances harder to hold. The church remained, still carving stones and copying manuscripts, but monasteries were no longer inviolable. The Norse had made sure of that. The sacred and the political alike were vulnerable to the sea. The decline of Dál Riata was thus a double-edged gift for the Picts. It removed a rival and briefly expanded their authority, but it also drew them deeper into the path of Viking warfare. In conquering their neighbour, they inherited its vulnerabilities. When Eogan fell at Fortiviot, the fragile balance of two kingdoms under one crown crumbled, leaving neither Pictland nor Dál Riata secure. What had seemed like the beginning of Pictish supremacy was, in truth, the beginning of the end. The disaster at Fortiviot in 839 left Pictland stunned. A generation of kings and nobles lay dead, their bodies scattered in the field, their bloodlines severed. The old rhythm of succession, complicated though it was, depended on a deep pool of eligible kin. Suddenly, that pool had been drained. The kingdom had not been conquered from without. It had hollowed itself in a single catastrophe. Into this vacuum stepped a man who would become both hero and villain in later memory. Kenneth MacAlpin, known to history as Syniad MacAlpin. Kenneth was a Gaelic ruler from Dál Riata, but his ancestry tied him to the Pictish royal house through his mother. This dual heritage gave him a claim that few could dispute. In a world where legitimacy was measured through both bloodline and force, he possessed enough of each to matter. By the early 840s, Kenneth had emerged as King of the Scots, ruling the remnants of Dál Riata from western lands battered by Viking raids. Soon after, he extended his reach eastward, across the old Pictish heartlands, and by the mid-century was recognized as king of both Picts and Scots. How he achieved this remains one of the great debates of Scottish history. Later chroniclers tell the story of the treachery of Scone, a tale in which Kenneth invited Pictish nobles to a feast, only to slaughter them when they were drunk, ensuring no rival could challenge him. It is a story of betrayal, massacre, and sudden conquest, as dramatic as any saga. Yet historians doubt its truth. The account appears centuries later, coloured by legend and political propaganda. More likely, Kenneth's rise was less theatrical, but no less decisive, the result of dynastic inheritance, opportunism, and the exhaustion of a Pictish elite broken by war. Still, the legend reflects the reality. However it happened, Kenneth's ascent marked the end of independent Pictish kingship. The royal line, once rich with rivals, had been narrowed to almost nothing by Viking slaughter. Kenneth's claim, part Pictish, part Gaelic, offered the only plausible continuity. To many of his contemporaries, his rule may have felt less like conquest and more like grim necessity. Better a king with Pictish blood than no king at all. Kenneth consolidated his power with shrewd symbolism. He is credited with moving the relics of St. Columba from Iona to Dunkeld, a safer inland monastery. The transfer was more than an act of piety. It shifted the spiritual center of power from the vulnerable west coast to the heart of his new realm, embedding Gaelic Christianity into Pictish lands. The bones of Columba, carried from island to glen, sanctified Kenneth's kingship and bound his subjects under the saint's protection. At Fortiviot and Scone, Kenneth established his political centres. Scone, in particular, became the site where kings were inaugurated, its traditions carrying forward into the medieval kingdom of Alba. Here, rituals blended Gaelic and Pictish elements, fusing two peoples into one crown. What began as improvisation in the face of crisis became the foundation of a new monarchy. For the Picts, the change was profound. Their royal line, once dominant across northern Britain, faded into silence. The Annals of Ulster record their last mentions in the 840s, after which the word Picts disappears from contemporary sources. Their people did not vanish overnight. Villages, farms, and carved stones remained. But their identity as a ruling nation ended. Where once there had been kings of the Picts, now there were kings of Alba, a realm that carried forward the lineage of Kenneth MacAlpin. Archaeology preserves traces of this transformation. Pictish symbol stones continue into the mid-9th century, but gradually give way to monuments carved with Gaelic inscriptions and Christian iconography. Place names shift too. Pit prefixes, reminders of Pictish settlements, survive alongside Kill and Dál names of Gaelic origin. Language itself was changing, the old P-Celtic tongue of the Picts giving way to Gaelic speech. Identity was being remade not through extermination, but through absorption. For Kenneth, this merging of peoples was as much political necessity as cultural destiny. He needed to present himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the heir of both traditions. By marrying Gaelic kingship with Pictish legitimacy, he created a hybrid monarchy that could claim continuity, even while transforming identity. The kingdom he forged was not entirely new, nor entirely old. It was something in between, a fusion born of crisis. Later legend turned Kenneth into the slayer of the Picts, the king who destroyed a nation to found Scotland. The reality is subtler, but no less final. The Picts were not slaughtered at a feast. They were swallowed by circumstance, their aristocracy broken, their line of kings extinguished. Kenneth did not kill them in a single night. He inherited their legacy and carried it forward under another name. By the time of his death in 858, Kenneth had laid the foundations of Alba, the kingdom that would evolve into medieval Scotland. The Picts, whose painted bodies had once haunted Roman chronicles, whose kings had defeated Northumbria and carved symbols into stone, were gone from the record. In their place stood a new realm, Gaelic in language, Christian in faith, and ambitious in its horizons. The doom of the Picts was not annihilation, but transformation. Their culture, their symbols, and their blood lived on, but under a crown that no longer bore their name. With Kenneth MacAlpin, the long arc of Pictish history came to its close, and the story of Scotland began. Kenneth MacAlpin's death in 858 did not end the tension between Pict and Scot, but it gave his heirs a throne that was larger than either alone. He had united two crowns through inheritance and necessity, and the next generation's task was to turn that fragile arrangement into permanence. From this effort came something new, a kingdom no longer Pictish, no longer purely Gaelic, but Alba. The succession, after Kenneth passed to his sons, Constantine I, 862 to 877, and Ayed, 877 to 878. Their reigns were short and troubled, overshadowed by Viking wars and internal rivalries. Constantine ruled for 15 years, a long reign by the standards of the age, but he spent much of it defending the realm against Norse pressure. The annals record raids striking across the north and into the heart of the kingdom. In 877, Constantine fell in battle, killed by Viking forces. His brother Ayed lasted scarcely a year before he too was slain, remembered in the chronicles with the epithet Ayed of the White Flowers, though the meaning of that phrase is lost to us. Their violent deaths remind us that Alba's early kingship was precarious. The new realm was not yet secure, its rulers vulnerable to both foreign enemies and domestic challenges. But even as kings fell, the idea of a unified kingdom endured. The Pictish line had been extinguished. There was no longer a separate kingship to rival the descendants of Kenneth. Every succession crisis from now on would be fought within the new dynasty, not between Pict and Scot. The shift in succession practices sealed the transformation. The matrilineal system of the Picts, where kingship often passed through the sister's line, faded into memory. The Gaelic model, patrilineal and dynastic, replaced it. This change was not simply administrative. It signaled the triumph of Gaelic custom over Pictish. In the structure of kingship itself, the Picts were gone. Language followed. The Pictish tongue, likely a P-Celtic language related to Brittonic, was already under pressure. Gaelic spread with the new ruling dynasty, reinforced by the church and by kinship with Dál Riata. Place names bear witness to the transformation. Prefixes such as pit, from the Pictish for portion or share of land, survive in names like Pitlochry and Pittenweem, fossils of a vanished tongue. The Aber prefix, meaning river mouth or confluence, lingers in places like Aberdeen and Abernethy, relics of Pictish geography. But new Gaelic markers, Kill for church, Dal for valley, spread across the map. Language was memory carved into land, and in this age the land itself began to speak Gaelic. Religion, too, reflected the shift. Columba's relics had been moved inland to Dunkeld by Kenneth, and under his successors, Dunkeld became a new spiritual centre. Monasteries that once served as distinctly Pictish were absorbed into a Gaelic ecclesiastical order. The cult of saints, carried from Ireland and the wider church, replaced older local devotions, yet traces of the Pictish past remained. Some symbol stones continued to be raised in the later 9th century, but now crosses dominated their designs, while inscriptions, when present, were in Latin or Gaelic. The mysterious symbols of the earlier centuries faded away. The artistic language of the Picts was closing, like a script that no one wrote any longer. Viking pressure drove much of this transformation. Alba's kings could not afford disunity when Norse armies carved through Britain. The saga of Thorstein the Red, a Norse warlord, illustrates the danger. In the later 9th century, Thorstein campaigned across northern Scotland, reportedly conquering large stretches of Caithness, Sutherland, Ross, and Moray. Though his control was temporary, the threat was real. The Pictish north was no longer a secure heartland, but a contested frontier. In response, Alba's kings consolidated power in the central regions, especially around Perthshire and Fife, areas easier to defend and closer to the church centres of Dunkeld and later St. Andrews. Economy played its quiet part in the transformation. Pictland had long been based on cattle wealth, and this remained true in Alba. Tribute was measured in herds, feasts in the slaughter of animals, prestige in the number of cattle a lord could command. But new pressures demanded adaptation. The Vikings disrupted coastal trade routes, forcing Alba to look inward, relying more heavily on agriculture in the fertile lowlands and on inland routes for communication. Silver chains, once symbols of Pictish nobility, ceased to be produced in this era, their tradition ending with the fall of Pictish kingship. In their place, Gaelic forms of ornament and currency gained ground. Even in fashion and wealth, one culture gave way to another. Politically, Alba was still fragile. Viking kingdoms had been carved into Dublin, York, and the Isles. To the south, the English kingdom of Wessex was beginning its rise under Alfred the Great. Alba could not compete with these powers in scale, but it could survive by cohesion. Every king, from Constantine onward, ruled not as a Pict or Scot, but as Rex Scotorum et Pictorum, king of the Scots and Picts. Over time, even this dual title shortened simply to King of Alba. The name first appears in the 9th century and soon became the accepted identity of the realm. To call oneself King of Alba was to acknowledge that the Picts as a political entity no longer existed. The cultural memory of the Picts, however, did not vanish overnight. Communities in the north and east still carried their traditions. Farmers still used old words. Stories were still told of ancient kings. Archaeology shows continuity of settlement, not destruction. The people remained. What changed was the frame through which they understood themselves. Identity shifted from tribal names and ancestral symbols to a broader, Gaelicized monarchy. The kingdom that emerged was not an erasure, but a merger, though one in which Gaelic culture dominated. The 9th century was thus less a moment of conquest than of transformation under pressure. The Vikings pressed from the seas, forcing unity. The old Pictish aristocracy had been shattered at Forteviot, making space for Kenneth's line to inherit without resistance. The church anchored the realm, moving relics and authority inland. Through these forces, Alba emerged, not fully formed, not unchallenged, but durable. By the year 900, the word Picts had almost disappeared from contemporary records. Chronicles spoke of the Scots and their kings. Alba had taken its place among the kingdoms of Britain. Yet the landscape kept its memory. Every pit and aber name, every weathered stone carved with crescent and rod, was a whisper of the old kingdom. The people themselves had not vanished, but they lived now under another name, part of a new story. In the space of half a century, the painted people of Roman legend, the warriors of Nechtansmere, the builders of brochs and carvers of symbols, were absorbed into Alba. Their legacy did not end. It was woven into Scotland. What had once been Pictland was now something else, something larger, a kingdom facing outward toward a new age. The old order was gone, but its bones lay everywhere, beneath the fields, in the stones, in the words still spoken by farmers. Alba was not the destruction of the Picts, it was their transformation. Alba had taken shape. Its kings spoke Gaelic. Its church aligned with Rome. Its chronicles no longer recorded the name of the Picts. Yet absence from record is not absence from the world. Across the northern landscape, the traces of the old kingdom endured. Stones carved with strange symbols, place names whispered in a language no longer understood, traditions carried by communities who had once called themselves Pictish. In the 10th century, the Picts were no longer a people of power, but they had not vanished. They remained as echoes, scattered and half forgotten in both land and memory. The chronicles of Ireland and Britain record only fleeting references. In 903, the Annals of Ulster mention a battle involving the men of Fortriu, a reminder that old identities still surfaced in certain contexts. But these are the last flickers. By mid-century, the word Pict had disappeared from contemporary writing. The kings of Alba were no longer kings of Picts and Scots, but simply rulers of Alba, a realm conceived as Gaelic in language and Christian in faith. Archaeology, however, speaks where the annals fall silent. Sites like Burghead on the Moray Firth reveal both continuity and change. The great promontory fort, with its timber halls and carved bull stones, remained in use into the early 10th century before being abandoned. Its monumental bulls, massive slabs, incised with images of power and fertility, are among the last defiantly Pictish statements, created even as their culture faded from political memory. Further inland, the Rhynie complex in Aberdeenshire shows another glimpse of Pictish ritual life. Here, a carved stone known as the Rhynie Man depicts a towering figure with an axe, possibly a god or ritual specialist. The site was associated with feasting, metalworking, and burials. Its use declined around this period, but the remains remind us that Pictish religious and ceremonial traditions had once flourished deep into the heartland. By the 10th century, such sites had fallen silent, leaving only their enigmatic stones as testimony. The symbol stones themselves remained scattered across the land, enduring long after their meanings had been forgotten. Crescents and rods, double discs, mirror and comb motifs, all continued to stand in fields and graveyards. Some were later repurposed, carved over with Christian crosses, or reused as building material. Others fell and were buried, only to be rediscovered centuries later by antiquarians. To the people of 10th century Alba, these stones must have seemed like relics of an older, half-pagan past, marking boundaries and memories that no longer made sense. Ogham inscriptions add another layer. A handful survive in the northeast, such as the Newton stone and the Scooney stone, inscribed with short texts that blend Pictish and Irish forms. Their language is fragmentary, almost impossible to parse, but they hint at attempts to write a tongue otherwise lost. These inscriptions are among the last surviving voices of the Pictish language, carved in characters borrowed from their Gaelic neighbours, struggling to set down in stone what was already slipping away. Even in death, the Picts left marks. Burial sites show a mix of traditions, Christian orientation, but with occasional traces of older ritual practices. In some places, grave goods linger: a pin, a knife, a bead. Such details suggest that Pictish communities did not vanish into Alba overnight, but slowly merged, bringing their habits with them into the new kingdom. Archaeology shows continuity of settlement. Villages and farms were not abandoned en masse. People stayed, fields were ploughed, cattle grazed. What disappeared was not the population, but the political identity that had once bound them together. Cultural memory carried fragments forward. In later medieval folklore, stories speak of mysterious peoples, builders of broches, dwellers in ancient forts, beings half human, half other. Some of these tales may preserve distorted memories of the Picts. To Gaelic storytellers, the Picts became a vanished race, remembered not as neighbours or rivals, but as mythic ancestors. Their stones and forts seemed the work of giants, their language a murmur from the past. In this way, the Picts slipped from history into legend. The Vikings, too, carried echoes of them. Norse sagas mention slaves taken from the northern coasts, and archaeology hints that Pictish captives were sold into Scandinavian markets. In this dark way, the Picts survived as commodities in Viking economies, their fate recorded not in chronicles, but in trade. The very people who had once resisted Rome and defeated Northumbria could now be found in the households of Iceland or Norway, nameless and unremembered. Economically, the new kingdom of Alba built upon Pictish foundations. Cattle remained the backbone of wealth, as they had for centuries, but tribute now flowed into Gaelic courts rather than Pictish ones. The silver chains of the old elite ceased to be made, replaced by brooches and ornaments of Gaelic design. Yet the land divisions, the farms, and the networks of power still bore the stamp of Pictish origins. The Gaelic kings ruled a society that still carried much of the structure their predecessors had forged. To walk through Alba in the 10th century was therefore to walk in a landscape thick with ghosts. The fortresses were still there, though some were abandoned. The stones still stood, though no one could read their meaning. The names of towns and valleys still whispered of the Pictish tongue. Yet the people themselves now called themselves something different, aligned to new kings and a new order. Their past had not vanished. It had been subsumed. By the year 1000, the Picts, as a distinct people, were gone. Their last references in chronicles were centuries behind. Their kingship had been replaced by Alba. Their language was extinct. Yet their presence endured in stone and soil. Every pit place name, every carved bull, every symbol stone was a reminder that beneath the Gaelic kingdom lay another, older layer. The kingdom of Alba was built not on ruins, but on absorption. The Picts were still there, ploughing, fishing, praying, but they no longer called themselves by that name. Their disappearance remains one of history's great enigmas. Unlike the Romans, they left no literature. Unlike the Anglo-Saxons, they left no chronicles of their own. What survives is fragmentary, half seen through the eyes of others, etched in stone without translation. And yet, though their voice fell silent, their presence has never quite faded. The Picts ended not with conquest, not with sudden annihilation, but with a long, quiet blending. Their kingdom was lost, but their echoes remained, carried in the land, in legend, and in the very foundations of Scotland itself. The story of the Picts does not end with their disappearance from chronicles. If anything, their absence gave birth to a second life. One lived in legend, scholarship, and imagination. After the year 1000, when Alba had taken firm shape and Gaelic identity was dominant, the Picts became a people of memory, not rulers of the present, but phantoms of the past. They were both real and mythic, their stones still standing, their language silent, their image reshaped by every generation that tried to explain them. Medieval chroniclers were the first to reinterpret them. Writers like Giraldus Cambrensis in the 12th century, and later Geoffrey of Monmouth, wove the Picts into broad narratives of Britain's origins. Sometimes they appeared as noble ancestors, sometimes as treacherous barbarians, sometimes as little more than placeholders in mythical genealogies. These accounts bear little resemblance to the people who had ruled northern Britain for centuries, but they reveal how deeply the Picts lingered in cultural memory. To medieval authors, the Picts were part of the great puzzle of Britain's past, to be fitted, however awkwardly, into biblical and classical frameworks of history. Legends circulated about their origins. Some claimed they had come from Scythia, wandering through Europe before settling in the north of Britain. Others insisted they were descendants of ancient giants, responsible for the great barocks and standing stones scattered across the highlands. Still others suggested they were sorcerers or fairies, their tattoos marks of supernatural power. These stories tell us more about the imagination of later centuries than about the Picts themselves. but they show how their disappearance invited myth to rush in where memory failed. The enigmatic symbol stones ensured that the Picts could never be entirely forgotten. Farmers ploughing fields came across slabs carved with crescents, rods, and strange beasts. Some were moved to churchyards. Others were incorporated into buildings. Their meanings were long lost, but their presence was undeniable. To medieval eyes, they seemed relics of an ancient, perhaps pagan race. To modern scholars, they remain one of the most tantalizing mysteries of early medieval Europe. Were they clan symbols, marks of rank, religious signs, a written language of sorts? Each theory has its adherents, but certainty eludes us. The stones, silent as ever, resist translation. The Pictish language itself vanished so completely that only fragments remain. A handful of inscriptions, some personal names preserved in charters, and place names scattered across the map are all that survive. Linguists debate whether it was a Celtic tongue akin to Brittonic, or something more distinct, perhaps even a non-Indo-European substrate. Whatever it was, by the 10th century, it had been supplanted by Gaelic, leaving only whispers behind. This linguistic silence is part of the Pictish mystique. They ruled for centuries, carved monuments across the land, and yet their words are lost. Folklore preserved echoes where language failed. In the highlands and islands, tales of the Pects, a diminutive ancient people, circulated for centuries. They were remembered as great builders who lived in brocks and underground houses, mighty in craft but doomed to fade. In some versions, they were giants. In others, they were small, almost fairy-like. Always, they were otherworldly, tied to the landscape but belonging to a vanished age. These stories, passed from hearth to hearth, kept the Picts alive in imagination long after their name had left the chronicles. From the 16th century onward, antiquarians began to study the stones and ruins in earnest. Scholars puzzled over the symbol stones, drew them in notebooks, and speculated about their origins. Some saw them as hieroglyphs, others as heraldic devices, others as traces of a forgotten alphabet. The brocks, with their towering walls, were often attributed to the Picts, who became credited, rightly or wrongly, as master builders of the north. The absence of written records made them a canvas for speculation. To early modern minds, the Picts were at once historical and mythical, a riddle waiting to be solved. Archaeology in the 19th and 20th centuries gave the Picts new life. Excavations revealed the richness of their settlements, from the hill fort at Craig Fadrig to the religious workshops of Port Mahomac. Finds of silver chains, carved stones, and fortified sites painted a picture of a sophisticated society, far removed from the barbarian caricatures of Roman writers. Modern scholarship has shown that the Picts were not a marginal people, but one of the most dynamic kingdoms of early medieval Britain, creators of art, shapers of politics, and survivors in a harsh world. Yet the enigma endures. We still cannot read their symbols. We cannot hear their language. Their sudden disappearance as a named people remains a haunting puzzle. Did they truly vanish, or did they simply merge into Alba so seamlessly that no one noticed the moment of transformation? Perhaps the doom of the Picts is less a tragedy of destruction and more a testament to cultural resilience. They were absorbed, not erased, their bloodlines and traditions flowing into the kingdom that became Scotland. Their legacy is everywhere in the modern landscape. Walk through Fife, Moray, or Caithness, and you will find pit names marking old divisions of land, silent markers of Pictish society. Visit Aberdeen, Aberfeldy, or Abernethy, and you hear echoes of their language in every Aber prefix. Stand before the Aberlemno stones, and you face scenes of battle and belief carved over a millennium ago. The Picts may be lost as a people, but they are present in every corner of the land they once ruled. Today, they hold a special place in the imagination of Scotland. They are the lost kingdom, the nation beneath the nation, the ancestors who built without leaving words, who carved without translation, who ruled and then dissolved into legend. Their mystery fuels fascination, inspiring novels, histories, and endless speculation. Every new excavation, every new theory about their language or symbols is greeted with excitement because it promises to bring us closer to a people who remain just out of reach. The Picts remind us of the fragility of memory. For centuries they were powerful, feared, and recorded in the annals of their neighbours. Within a few generations, they had become a whisper, their name vanishing even as their descendants lived on. Their story warns us that kingdoms can vanish, not only by conquest, but by transformation. Their identity dissolved into something new. And yet, the Picts are not gone. They survive in stone, in legend, in the very foundations of Scotland. Alba rose on their shoulders. Scotland grew from Alba. To tell the story of Scotland is to tell the story of the Picts, the painted ones who carved their world into stone and whose silence still challenges us to listen. The Picts began as rumour in Roman chronicles. They ended as legend in Scottish folklore. In between, they ruled a kingdom, fought kings, embraced faith, and carved their presence across a land. Their story is not simply one of loss, but of endurance, an unfinished sentence still written in stone across the north.